Check mic. Check, check, mic check. It's not working? We're good? طيب السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ونتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So welcome to our second session of a journey to the hereafter. And as I mentioned, inshallah, this is going to be a bit of a series. And I tend to, I guess it's a bit of my habit to kind of take my time with a lot of these things. Because there's no rush, really. And it's one of those things that, like, alhamdulillah, it's meant to increase our conviction, increase our, give us awareness of our aqidah. But at the same time, it has a spiritual aspect to it, right? Because talking about these things tend to bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to give us a reality or a perspective of the reality of what we're going through this time or what's important and so forth. And so that is the hopefully inshallah the beneficial aspect of it, right? So a combination between a aspect of belief and conviction, and a part of it is tazkiyah and purification of the heart. Type. So last time when we left off, we were talking about, what were we talking about? I know he was near Sheikh. Type, what were we talking about? What's it called? Yes. Minor signs of the Day of Judgment, right? So we're starting with the minor and the major signs of the Day of Judgment. And then we're going to transition to the journey of the soul, death, and then the barzakh, which is the grave, and then resurrection, what happens, and then inshallah, the qiyamah and so forth, and then Jannah and hellfire. So that is the trajectory that we're going to go through, inshallah. And so we were talking about the minor signs, right? We're talking about the minor signs, and we talked about some of the benefits associated with learning the minor signs. And one thing we mentioned is that it gives us a conviction and certainty because these are things that the Prophet ﷺ prophesied, right? And they were in extreme details. And we mentioned quite a few of the alamat sughra, right? The minor signs. And one thing you're going to recognize is that the minor signs the Prophet ﷺ mentioned throughout the different hadith, there's actually a lot of them, right? There's a lot of minor signs. We already went through, I can't remember how much we went through actually, but we're going to divide them in different ways. So we at least took 10 last time, and this time we're almost going to take another 10 or 12. But I divided them a bit differently because I wanted to look at both how the scholars divide them. So some of the scholars divide them without any sort of specific order, just based on the hadith. They just mention one after the other. But another way of dividing it is looking at the minor signs of things that have already happened in past, things that have happened and continue to happen, and things that, the third category is things that haven't happened yet, right? So it's a bit more of like an intellectual division. And so today I'm going to adopt that methodology, but I'm also going to mention things that we did not mention last time, right? So we already mentioned 10 things before. Today, inshallah, we're going to mention other things. And so from the category of the minor signs, things that have already happened, right? Things that are gone. And most people don't realize this, right? But it's actually the Prophet ﷺ being sent as a prophet and the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So both of them are considered minor signs. And this comes straight from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ when he said, بُعِثْتُ أَنَا وَالسَّاعَةَ كَهَاتَيْنِ, right? I was sent, me and the Day of Judgment, like these two. And so then he said, وَقَرَنَ وَيَقْرَنُ بَيْنَ إِصْبَعِهِ وَالسَّبَّابَ, right? بَيْنَ إِصْبَعِهِ وَالسَّبَّابَ. And so al-wusta. So he went like this, right? He said, me and the Day of Judgment were sent like this. طيب. And then in another hadith, right? So this is the Prophet ﷺ, which means I've been sent as a prophet. But then another hadith, he said, أُعْدُدْ سِتًّا بَيْنَ يَدَيِ السَّاعَةِ moti, right? One of them he said moti. He said, count 6 things before the Day of Judgment, and he counted one of them is my death. So if you look at this hadith, when the Prophet ﷺ said, me and the Day of Judgment were sent like this, close to each other, right? And then so the Prophet ﷺ was sent, when was he sent? How many thousand years ago? $400 and? What year are we in? What year are we in? 1447. And then add another 10 years to that. Because that was, 13 years. Because that was in Mecca. So that will give you what? 1447 plus 13. 1460. 1460, right? So 1,460 years ago. Okay. Now, one can ask, if the Prophet ﷺ said he was sent to him in the Day of Judgment like this, it's been 1,460 years, and we still haven't even seen the major signs yet. So how is it this close then? طيب, that's an answer. So essentially, one of the answers over here that Sheikh Amr over here is saying is that this is if you're talking about days in the eyesight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're different than our days, right? That's an answer. But there's a bit more of a closer. Our day of judgment starts when we die. That is true, but it's been 1,460 years, Sheikh. That's true, but Prophet, so here's the thing. Prophet said, between me being sent and Day of Judgment is like this. So the demarcation is not ourselves, but the Prophet being sent. Say that again. That is extremely close. So it's talking about relative. So the Prophet ﷺ, as he's talking about over here, is what is remaining from the life of this world since its creation. Right? If you look at how many thousands and perhaps Allah Alam years have passed since the creation of this world and since Adam was brought down to this earth, right, until what is remaining from the time of the Prophet ﷺ being set to the end, if you take that scale and relatively speaking, then it is that short, right? That is the closest interpretation of Allah Alam. But some had mentioned that in the eyesight of Allah Ta'ala that whatever 50,000 ألف سنة, 50,000 years, like a day in the eyesight of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, about 1,000 years from what you count, and the different narrations and understandings of it, and so forth. But Allah Alam, the closest understanding is it more if we're looking at the grander scheme of things, the relativity of it is not we're talking about from this to that, but it's more of the entire time scale, that truly what's remaining is only just that little bit, right? It's just like 2 dots remaining, and that's it, right? Of course, you're going to zoom into it a bit more, and then it looks larger, but if you zoom out compared to the lifespan of this earth and when it's going to end, this clarifies it. Wallahu alam. طيب. The other sign that has happened, and it was gone, and this happened when the Prophet was in Mecca, is the splitting of the moon. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, اقتربت الساعة وانشق القمر. Right? The day of the اقتربت الساعة, which means the hour has come close, وانشق القمر, and the moon had split. And this happened due to a challenge from the people of Quraysh. They asked the Prophet ﷺ for a miracle, for a sign. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he narrated, and this is in Sahih Bukhari, and this narration by Bukhari, but also reported by Imam Muslim, and another narration by Bukhari in different variations. But the gist of it is that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he said, انشق القمر في على عهد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فرقتين. That the moon had split during the era of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم into 2 parts, فرقتين. فرقة فوق جبل وفرقة دونه. Right? A part of above a mountain, and another narration clarifies that it is the mountain of Hira. Right? And then the other one is in front of it, so it's like a huge split. And وَفَقَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم اشْهَدُوا. So the Prophet ﷺ said, bear witness, right, to the people of Quraysh. And so this was a huge miracle that this happened. Now what's interesting is, how did the people of Quraysh respond to it? قالوا إنما سكرت أبصارنا. Right? This is a magician, this is magic. You have done some sort of deception, where the interesting thing is everybody in Mecca have seen it, but also people out of Mecca have seen it, right? And it was reported they've seen it, and so this becomes something that is mutawatir, right? Abundant in transmission, right? Of course, I'm not going to go to the science of it. Did they find there's a fission or a cleft in the moon when they landed, or when they see the pictures, whatever the case is. I'm not going to go into those details, because honestly it doesn't matter to me. The fact that it's transmitted for us with narrations that are authentic from the time of the Prophet ﷺ for us as Muslims is sufficient. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. The other sign that the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that was from the minor sign of the Day of Judgment, and it happened already, was the conquest of Al-Maqdis, Fath Bayt al-Maqdis. Right, so Auf ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, he said that the Prophet ﷺ said, "U'udud sittan bayna yadi as-sa'a," and I mentioned the first part of this hadith. He said, count 6 things before the Day of Judgment. Mawti thumma fathu Bayt al-Maqdis. Right, so the first one was the death of the Prophet ﷺ. The second was the conquest of Fath Bayt al-Maqdis. And Bayt al-Maqdis was first conquered in the time of which Khalifa? Umar al-Khattab. And this was in the 16th year of Hijrah, which was very soon after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Right, so the Prophet ﷺ died in the 10th year of Hijrah, right? Then, or technically died in the 11th year, but this is like 5 years afterwards. Now, this is really important because remember, the prophecies of the Prophet ﷺ, when he made them, they were very specific, but he also mentions things that would happen in his time, but things that were close to his time. Any person who's an imposter, like, who's fabricating things, would want to make sure that he would never be discovered even years later, right? And so when the Prophet ﷺ said that it'll be conquered, 6 years later, Umar al-Khattab, he had conquered the Bayt of al-Maqdis. And then it happened also again, right, in the time of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, right? And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring it back to us again, inshallah, in the near future. Say Ameen. Type. So these are some of the things that have happened and they're gone. Now, what's interesting are the things that the Prophet prophesied that would happen, that have happened, and they continue to happen in our own time. Right? And for me, this is like, of course the past is kind of interesting, but it's different when you witness things, right? It's different when you live through things that has a different, sense and a feeling to it, right? It has different effect than we talk about things that happened in the past, right? So I'm going to mention a bit more of the things that have happened, and they continue to happen in our time. And by the way, and the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning this can be more at a global scale, but also more specifically things that are happening to the Muslim Ummah themselves. Right, so more of a global scale, but also to the ummah. Because remember, if you're talking about the moral values, or the moral values of the human population, it's decreasing, right, over time. And so you see some of those things happening, even though at one period of time, for example, it was considered something that is negative. You don't see it as much, but now you see it more often, right? And so, for example, over here, one of the signs that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, he said, is the spread of zina, right? Zina, which is adultery and fornication, and excessive drinking of alcohol, right? So those two things were mentioned: the spread of zina and the excessive drinking of alcohol. And this narrated on Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu. He said, "لا تقوم قال الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تقوم الساعة," right? وإما قال من أشراط الساعة. So either he said the day of judgment will not happen, or from the signs of the day of judgment, أن يرفع العلم ويظهر الجهل. Right, so we'll talk about this later. So يرفع العلم, which means that knowledge would be taken, right? ويظهر الجهل, and ignorance would be widespread. ويشرب الخمر, that is the one I want to mention. ويظهر الزنا, ويشرب الخمر, which means alcohol will be drunk. People drink it, and zina would spread, would appear, right? Would be obvious, right? And then the continuation narration is that ويقل الرجال, and men will be fewer in number. ويكثر النساء حتى يكون ل50 امرأة قيم واحد, until that for every woman, for every 50 women, they only have one male to be responsible for them, right? So this hasn't happened yet, but we're seeing some of those signs. So statistically speaking, the population of females are much more than they are in males. It hasn't reached yet to the point where there's only one male in charge of 50 women of perhaps his relatives, right? And we're talking about extended family, Allah alam, but we're seeing some of those signs already, right? Statistically speaking, if you look at birth rates and so forth, or even mortality rates, or generally speaking, the population, women are larger in population in numbers than there are men, right? Allah alam. Type. And so this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned, he said that alcohol is being drunk quite often, and zina is spread, right? So if you look at the time that we live in, right? So it's easy to talk about the Muslims, right? The fact that, what's the percentage of marriage now? Anywhere between 1 to 5%, right? Percent of marriage? You guys ever look at that? Type. The percent of people actually, somebody look it up quickly. Percent of marriage in the US. Right? It will be anywhere between 1 to 5%, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. More? It's 8? What? Percentage of marriage. Are you sure? People getting married. Of what? No, no. The US, not the Muslims. I'm exiting the Muslims. Huh? 5 is marriage percent? Marriage rate? طيب. I must have been looking at more specific details. Because there's a breakdown of then, like, the Caucasian, and then there's the Latinos, and then there's the Muslim population, or by religion, Christians, whatever the case is. But let's say, right, 50%, for the sake of calculation, let's say 50% of people are getting married. Okay? Now, are the other 50% of the population, let's say not 50%, right? We'll say, خليها, well, actually, you know what? These are probably like adults looking at it. The other 50%, are we saying, mashallah, they're practicing like a chaste life? That they don't have any partners or anything like that? No, right? So 50%, but I want to compare that to 100 years ago, right? If you look at 100, 150 years ago, like, there was never, like, rarely would be any sort of relationship outside of marriage, right? 100, 150 years ago, it was considered like a blasphemy, like a something that is dishonorable, something that's looked at. Nowadays, right, it's considered weird if you don't have a partner at one point, starting when, like, high school, right, for example. Now, transitioning into the Muslims, the sad reality is that also shifted to our Muslim world, for whatever reason it is, because maybe perhaps there's not enough marriages happening. But even the rate of, like, marital betrayal that is happening in the Muslim world is ridiculous. Like, it's showing up on the surface, right? Of course, we can start talking about the circumstances associated with it, the lack of religiosity, the spread of, like, nudity, the spread of, like, ideologies through TV and screens and shahawat and desires. These are all factors, of course, but it does not, like, we're just talking about the reality of zina and fornication spreading, right? And the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned this. This is a reality that we see, right? And it happens to both genders, males and females, right? And at a very high rate, unfortunately. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our children. Ameen. Type. The other one is the spread of alcohol, right? The spread of drinking alcohol. Let's focus at the Muslim countries, or Muslims. Just the Muslims, right? The reality is it has spread more than we would like in the Muslim countries. More than we'd like. And even openly being sold publicly in many areas. All you have to do is walk with an idea, nobody tells you anything, right? That's it. And that's for whatever, like, like, under whichever guise, like, they want to talk about it. And one of the times they like, they asked, like, the Prophet ﷺ, like, how would this stuff spread, right? And so he said, they name it other than its real name. They'll name it other than its real name. And unfortunately, for example, in Egypt, I saw an advertisement that I thought was very appalling, especially considering Egypt is, like, the country of Al-Azhar and so forth. It was a advertisement for a type of beer, right? And it said, "Be a man." That's it. Right? Now, talk to a 18-year-old, 21-year-old sees that. With their mindset, they're still incomplete, like, development of the frontal cortex or whatever the case is, and it just says, that is shaping in their mind what man looks like, right? And then add to that the different, like, TV shows that you see of what is considered of a high-class behavior, right? And by the way, this behavior was, you'd see that if you're, like, if you, like, I don't know, I'm very familiar with the, like, with the Egyptian, because at that time, like, at that time period between, like, 40s, 50s, 60s, like, Egypt pretty much was like this Arab cinematic of the Muslim countries. But in those movies, consistently, the high, classy people, what were they doing? They're what? They're drinking alcohol, right? And what about the Muslim, like, poor class? the trashy class, right? They looked shabby, ignorant. And so these are subliminal messages that are constantly being set, right? And so when you have a generation that grows up like that, right, and it kind of there's a bit more of a loose behavior associated with it, and then to the point that now we forget. So here's how it works: we forget the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that talks about, like, there are 10 people that are damned, right? There's a la'na about 10 individuals that are associated with alcohol, whether it's the person who is, like, buying it, selling it, transporting it, pouring it, like, serving it, drinking it, of course. All these things associated with it. The one who like, makes it, produces it. All these have a la'na, which means there's a damnation, right? You're expelled from the mercy of Allah Ta'ala. And we think that what is the sin is to just drink alcohol. And so many of the Muslims, especially in this country, they're okay with hanging around with their friends when they are drinking alcohol, right? A lot of times when you want to have a business meeting, guess where it happens? At a dinner, right? And then there's alcohol being involved, right? But when you put yourself in that environment, and by the way, it happens also in our Muslim countries, when they invite people from outside, whatever the case is, they have no problem serving alcohol, sitting with them. But the minute you do that, the minute you sit with them, whether we like it or not, depending on the individual's, like, religiosity and practice, eventually at one point hang around that environment for too long, eventually you'll drink, at least out of trying it out, right? It might take 5 years, it might take 10 years, right? That environment is just a negative environment, and so people end up doing it, right? We all have, like, our personal experience stories of individuals that, mashallah, in the beginning they were fine, but because they sat in the environment for too long, at one point they started doing it, right? And some have repented, some have continued to do it, right? But unfortunately, that's how it is, right? And the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned this, and so it spread, and it will continue to increase the spread under whatever guise, right? Now, some people might put underneath that category other forms of intoxicants, whether they're drugs or whatever the case is, but we'll stick to the literal hadith, which is just drinking alcohol. Right. Type. What are the other signs that continue that have happened and continue to happen? Is where the Prophet ﷺ is talking about over here, intisharu riba, right? So the spread of riba, usury and interest. And so the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he said, بين يدي الساعة يظهر الربا, right? Between the day of judgment, بين يدي الساعة, like ahead of the day of judgment, يظهر الربا. Riba will appear. Now, of course, riba did exist at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but it was very kind of it was localized to the to the Jewish population when they dealt with the Arabs and the Arabs. But we're talking about over here as Muslims, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had prohibited riba, and riba became eliminated from the Muslim territories. So this hadith is talking about the Prophet ﷺ, is talking about among the Muslim ummah, riba was spread. And another hadith that kind of clarifies it, although there's a debate on its authenticity, and you can find that in Sunan Abi Dawud, Sunan Ibn Majah, Abu radiallahu anhu, he said that the Prophet ﷺ said, يَأْتِ عَلى النَّاسِ زَمَان, there will come a time upon the people, لَا يَبْقَى فِيهِ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا أَكَلَ الرِّبَى. There will be no a time where there will nobody left except that they would have eaten, which means engaged in riba. فَمَنْ لَمْ يَأْكُلْ مِنْهُ, and so whomever does not eat from it, like directly, أَصَابَهُ مِنْ غُبَارِ, he'll be afflicted by its dust, right? Welcome to the world economy, right? The bank system, the world bank system, we cannot avoid it one way or another, perhaps, right? Especially with the time that we live in right now, we live in the States, it's so difficult to avoid some sort of either you're forced to engage in it, or there's yes, you're not directly involved, but there's maybe 2 or 3 or 4 people between you and that, then it trickles down to you, right? Of course, it doesn't mean that it's permissible to engage in it, or whatever traces left that affect us, that we have sins associated with it. As I said, it's unavoidable, right? It becomes a necessity that we have to, at least becomes around us one way or another. But unfortunately, once again, even in the Muslim world, this happens, right? And sometimes it even happens out of I'm going to say a mistaken ijtihad from some of the scholars. It's a minority opinion, right? For example, they'll tell you that the interest you have from your savings account is halal. I know some people are frowning. I can produce the fatwa from in Arabic, of course, right? But some of the scholars, when they looked at it, and the way they looked at it, they said, hey, listen, this is the cost of inflation. Of course, it's completely not true, right? It doesn't matter. That's completely not true. That, that excuse is invalid. And that's why that's a minority opinion. Until this day, the majority opinion from the, from majalis al-fiqh, right, from um, uh, the jurisprudence organizations, the major ones, they'll continue to tell you it's haram, right? But there is a minority opinion, they'll start saying that it is permissible. And so that's how people sometimes get engaged in it, right? Wallahu a'lam. طيب. So, spread of riba, right? Now, this 1, 2, 3, the fourth one, right? The Prophet had mentioned that we see nowadays, he said, kathratul qatl, right? Which, abundance of killing or like widespread bloodshed. And this is also from Hadith Abu Hurairah anhu. He said, لا تقوم الساعة حتى يكثر الهرج, right? The day of judgment will not happen until there's an increase of al-harj. And so that word, the companions wanted to know what it is. فقالوا يا رسول الله وما الهرج؟ قال القتل القتل. So he said, what's al-harj? He said, like, killing and killing, like, or murder, right? He's talking about bloodshed. And in another elaboration, right, of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ would say that the person would not know why he got killed. When the person doing the killing might not even know why why he killed that specific person, right? So it's like a fitna that happens, but we see that, right, especially towards the Muslim nowadays, like the mass killing that is happening to our brothers and Muslims in Islam who are civilians in different places, right? Whether it is happening in in Palestine, or whether it's happening in even generally speaking, like human population deaths, right? In Iran, the civilians that happen in Iran, right? In Sudan, because of the civil wars that are happening there, close enough what's happening in Kashmir area, or Afghanistan, or all these areas, the death that is happening unnecessarily, right? The widespread amount of killing that's happening. This is something Prophet had mentioned, right? Now, this could happen also in different periods of time and continue to happen, wallahu alam, right? So, for example, at the time of the Tatar, right, the Mongols, when they attacked the Muslim countries, and they would said the rivers would flow with blood, for example, right? So this seems to happen, continue to happen over time, wallahu alam. The other thing the Prophet had mentioned that we continue to see now, that has happened, we continue to see, he said, at-tatawulu fil bunyan, right? Tawul fil bunyan, which means that the people compete in constructing tall buildings, right? So in a hadith, Prophet said, also narrated by Abu Hurairah, وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ رِعَاءَ الْبُهْمِ, right? رِعَاءَ الْبُهْمِ يَتَطَاوَلْنَ فِي الْبُنْيَانِ. And another narration, رِعَاءَ النَّاسِ يَتَطَاوَلْنَ فِي الْبُنْيَانِ. When you see the رِعَاءَ الْبُهْمِ, which means the insignificant shepherds, which means that these are people who are disheveled, they have no education, no knowledge, whatever the case is, they're insignificant individuals. What's going to happen is they start competing in high-rise buildings, right? And we obviously see, right, we don't have to walk very far, right? Walk into Dubai, unfortunately even walk into Mecca now, starting to walk in Medina. Medina is starting to develop some of that stuff. Walk into many of the cities, there's actual competition between who has the highest building in the world, right? Is it Burj Khalifa, or the clock tower, or is it whatever, right? And so they are competing in high-rise buildings, and this is something that we see at the moment. Type. So how many did you cover so far? 5? I thought it was 6. 2, 3, 4, 5. صح. طيب. 6th one, right? The Prophet said, which is ظهور الكاسيات العاريات, right? The appearance of women who are clothed yet naked. The appearance of women that are clothed but yet naked. And this is directly from the hadith of Prophet ﷺ, and this is narrated by Imam Muslim rahimahullah. Abu Hurairah anhu said that the Prophet ﷺ said, صنفان من أهل النار لم أرهما. 2 types of people from the people of the hellfire that I have not seen. Which means that they were not at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. These were going to happen later on. He said, قوم معهم صياط كأذناب البقر يضربون بها الناس. People that have whips, right, that are like the tail of cows that they strike people with. That's one category. And then the other one, he said, وَنِسَاءٌ كَاسِيَاتٌ عَارِيَاتٌ مُمِيلَاتٌ مَائِلَاتٌ, right? And women that are dressed, they're clothed, but yet they're naked. مَائِلَاتٌ مُمِيلَاتٌ. مَائِلَاتٌ, which means that they are, there's different ways to explain this, but they are kind of مَائِلَاتٌ, which means they're kind of leaning away, like the way that either they walk or they are veering off the straight path. مُمِيلَاتٌ, which means they lead others in the same way, right? Or teach others the same thing. Wallahu alam. رؤوسهن كأسنام البخت المائلة, that they're like a ru'usuna, which means on their head is like a, like the camel hump, right? It's like a camel hump, right? That is tilted. There's many interpretations to that, right? Some say it's the different hairstyles. Some say it's a different whatever the case is. But the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يدخلن الجنة. They will not enter Jannah. ولا يجدن ريحها, and they will never even feel or sense its scent. وإن ريحها لا يوجد من مسيرة كذا وكذا. And the scent of Jannah can be sensed from a distance of walking of, so and so. In another hadith, 50,000 years, right? So which means that these women, right, that are clothed but not clothed, they will not enter Jannah. Now, does that mean they're going to be eternally in the hellfire? No, Shaykh, they're not disbelievers. They're Muslims, but they're sinful Muslims. But that sin is so huge that they're not going to enter Jannah immediately or from the first wave. They're going to be expelled and further away from it. They will be in the hellfire, but as long as they're Muslims, eventually every Muslim, no matter how sinful they are, will enter Jannah, right? But in the end, we don't want to expose ourselves to that, right? And so, if we look at I'm just going to stick to the majority of Muslim women, right? The majority of Muslim women in the world, right? Can we say that 90% are wearing proper hijab? The reality is not, unfortunately, right? Like, this is a manifestation. Now, it's not that they're just not wearing hijab. Many of them are pretty much, once again, they're mirroring the fashion of the non-Muslims. That's it, right? The exact mirroration of it. And they're clothed, but they're not clothed. And this can happen one of two ways, right? Either the clothing that they're wearing is so tight that it pretty much describes every part of their body. Okay, and we've seen that. We've seen sisters that wear hijab. However, their outfit is so tight that every part of their body, there's nothing else left to conceal, literally, right? That defies the whole idea of a hijab. Hijab means to conceal, right? Hijab means to conceal. There's nothing being concealed. Now, the other way this also happened is that they're clothed, but they're not clothed. They're wearing fabrics, but they're not covering much, either because it's transparent or it's not fully covering, right? Parts of the body are showing, a shoulder is showing, there's like a chest showing, or whatever part of the legs are showing, and so forth. And so that is also, they're naked, but they're clothed, right? They're not covering what they're supposed to cover. And unfortunately, right, the reality is, because we have not put in the time to, similar to how we teach our sons and daughters how to pray, we have not teach our sons and daughters what is the proper way of clothing. I'm just saying both, right? Boys and girls, because, boys, for example, they tend to wear shorts they're not supposed to be wearing for the sake of sports, for example. And they have this excuse, Shaykh, this above the knee, Allah is going to care about it? Yes, because Allah told you to do it, right? You're not the one that judges does he care about it or not. He's the one that tells you what to do, right? And the sister, when she says, yeah, Shaykh, is this part of my neck going to make a difference? Allah said it will make a difference, right? It's not for you to decide. It's Allah to tell you what to do. Our position is that we're slaves. But this is something that's dangerous, right? Because then this becomes like a domino effect, right? And one of the most interesting arguments is, when a sister says, why are you looking at me, right? You should lower your gaze. That's true. The brother should lower his gaze, but also you should do your job and you should cover up, right? You have to understand that our sexual instinct is the most powerful instinct. And there's a reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the male to lower his gaze, not the female, right? Of course, unless she's looking at her awrah, but usually the male to lower his gaze and the woman to wear hijab. Right? There's a reason behind that, right? Because otherwise, once, the hijab is taken off and all the, adornments of the female is exposed publicly, and then you're asking the young individuals to, tolerate themselves and hold themselves and control themselves. And then if they're married, they go home and be happy with their wives that are, they're tired, they have given birth, their bodies are changing. That leads to a slew of problems, right? A huge social issue that started by just not listening to the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we can get to that into details, but a lot of it is that both sides are not obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The lowering of the gaze, but also wearing the hijab, that is fundamental. That is part of the major objective of Sharia, of protecting, right, which is preservation of lineage and honor. That is fundamental, right? Wallahu alam. Type. So that is from the things that are happening. Now, there are things that the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned in the minor signs that have not happened yet. All right, and I'm going to mention a few things quickly so we can transition people perhaps, inshallah, if we have time, to the major signs, inshallah. But one of the things that the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned in this category is عودة جزيرة العرب جنات وأنهار, right? That the Arabian Peninsula will return back to gardens and rivers, to gardens and river, like forests and gardens and rivers. And it's kind of interesting because when he said it goes back to it, it means that the Arabian Peninsula used to be a very place that is flourished with greenery and rivers, right? And the evidence for that is what? Oil. Thank you. Right? The mass amount of oil that you find in that region, essentially that's what it is. Right? It is fossilized, trees and things, vegetations that were there under pressure. That is what forms oils and petroleum and whatever the case is. Right? That's why it's filled the area. And so the Prophet ﷺ, as narrated by Abu Hurairah anhu, and this is narrated by Imam Ahmed and Imam Muslim rahimahullah, and this specific narration is by Imam Ahmed. Abu Hurairah said, لا تقوم الساعة حتى تعود أرض العرب مروجا وأنهارا. That the day of judgment will not happen until the Arabian Peninsula will return back to murujan wa anhara. Murujan is talking about greenery, right? Wa anhara, and rivers. Now, what's interesting is that if you compare the amount of rain and greenery in the Arabian Peninsula, compare it to 30, 40 years ago, there's a huge difference. There's actually more rain falling in the Arabian Peninsula. There is more natural greenery that is coming. Still not back as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, but it is starting, right? This kind of starting about. And of course, over time, and Allah alam if this is because of the global warming effect, Allah alam, right? But there's a change in climate that nobody can deny. Allah alam. Type. Now the other interesting one that the Prophet had mentioned that hasn't happened yet is تكليم السباع والجماد الإنس, is that the wild beasts and inanimate objects will speak to the humans. And so this the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned in the hadith Sa'id Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radhiyallahu anhu. He said, وَالَّذِي نفسي بيده, by the one whom my soul is in his hand, لا تقوم الساعة حتى تكلم السباع الإنس. That the day of judgment will not happen until the wild beasts, right? Siba' over here is talking about the kind of the vicious animals, essentially, the vicious wild beasts. They will speak to the human beings. وحتى يكلم الرجل عذبة صوته, right? And so until the salt, which is the whip, right? The end of the whip will talk to the person. وشراك نعلي, and the laces of his sandals will talk to him. وتخبره فخذه بما أحدث أهله بعده, and even his own thighs will speak to him of what is his family had done in his absence, right? And so literally, like this hadith, many of the scholars said this hadith is literal. Like animals will talk to the human beings, right? They will have a conversation. And the Prophet had mentioned in a hadith that this had happened before when a wolf had taken a sheep, and the shepherd chased that wolf until he rescued that sheep from him, and the wolf spoke, and he said, "You take something from me that Allah has written for me," right? And he came back and he mentioned the story, and the Prophet had acknowledged, the Prophet had mentioned that story. And so it's not something that is strange. And if we believe in the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we believe in the ability of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is strange. Like we know that on the day of judgment, our hands will speak of what we've done, right? And our feet will speak, right? Our mouth will seal, and this would happen, right? If the pebbles, right, are able to do tasbih and the companions would hear it, and it doesn't need any sort of vocal cords or mouth or anything like that, this is from the ability of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we believe that those things are true, right? Wallahu alam. Now, obviously these things are things that defy natural norms, right? But the fact that they defy natural norms is an indication that the time, that the hour has approached. Because it's time now things are not as they are, as the norm as they are. This is more of moving forwards in time. طيب, one of the other signs the Prophet had mentioned is انحسار الفرات عن جبل من ذهب, right? That the receding of the Euphrates River will it will recede and will reveal a mountain of gold, like an entire mountain of gold. And so this narrated by Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تقوم الساعة حتى يحسر الفرات عن جبل ذهب. So that the day of judgment will not happen until the Euphrates would recede and would reveal a mountain of gold. يقتتل الناس عليه, that the people will, over which people will fight. People will fight over it. Who's going to get it? فيقتل من كل 199, and 99 out of every 100 will be killed. ويقول كل رجل منهم لعلي أكون الذي أنجو, and each man, right, and every man among them will say, perhaps I'll be the one that survives. And so people will be killing each other to attain that mountain of gold, and each one of them will say, maybe I'll be the one that survives this. Wallahu a'lam. And so that is one of the signs that haven't happened yet. Wallahu a'lam. The other sign, and I'm sure because of what was happening in Al-Maqdis, right? You've probably heard this hadith already. And so this had to do with the ruin of Yathrib, Kharab Yathrib, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, in a hadith narrated by Abu Dawood, rahimahullah, narrated by Mu'adh ibn Jabal, he said, the Prophet ﷺ said, Imranu Bayt al-Maqdis, Kharab Yathrib. Imranu Bayt al-Maqdis, Kharab Yathrib, which means the flourishing of al-Maqdis will be the ruin of Yathrib. So it's things that would happen, right? So the rebuilding or the flourishing of Bayt al-Maqdis. And over here it means that it be flourished with increasing population of people, wealth will start spreading, trade will flourish and so forth. Kharabu Yathrib will lead to the ruin of Yathrib, which is Medina, right? And so we're talking about over here the current Medina, Dar al-Hijrah. Now this means that the Bayt al-Maqdis, it being it flourishes, is a sign that Medina will become ruined, right? Some say it will be the cause of the ruin of Medina, or just maybe a sign of the ruin of Medina, right? And then the Prophet said, وَخَرَابُ يَثْرِبْ خُرُوجُ الْمَلْحَمَةِ, right? And the ruin of Yathrib is the outbreak of al-Malhama, which is the Great War. And so once this, the destruction of Yathrib happens, this will lead to the following thing, which is the Great War, right? وَخَرَابُ وَخُرُوجُ الْمَلْحَمَةِ, right? And the outbreak of the Great War, فَتْحِ الْقُسْطَنطِنِيَّةِ, would lead to the conquest of Constantinople, right? Conquest of Constantinople. وَفَتْحُ الْقُسْطَنطِنِيَّةِ خُرُوجُ الدَّجَّالِ, and the conquest of Constantinople will be the emergence of or lead to the emergence of the Dajjal. And this is the end of the hadith, right? And the Prophet ﷺ kind of struck the thighs of Mu'adh ibn Jabal, and he continued mentioning a few things, but this is the gist of it, right? And so this tells us that at one point or another, Medina will become destroyed, right? Or will become empty. In some narrations, they will that I've seen, will talk about how Medina will become empty and barren, like there's actually no animal life in it, animals or humans. There will just be vegetation at one point. And that it mentions the hadith that a shepherd will be coming with his flock, and one of them crosses the boundaries and goes in there, right? And he tries to chase it, and they both die. So Allah Alam, the reason, is it a plague? Is it some sort of something that is biological, or something that is toxic, or whatever the case is, Allah Alam. But this will happen at one point, until later on, Wallahu Alam, right? It will flourish back again. Like Medina will flourish back again. Trying to remember, there's another hadith. I think those are two hadiths that I remember on top of my head. Hold on. Yes, Shaykh. This is closer to the time of the Dajjal. This is closer to the time of the Dajjal. Because the Dajjal will be coming and be guarded, And everything that is only Muslims will inhabit it, the non-Muslims will be فَتَرْجُ الْمَدِينَ غَشْفَ فَيَخْرُجُ مِنْهَا الْمُنَافِقُونَ, right? They'll run out of it, wallahu a'lam. If I remember correctly, right? That's the time frame. No, no. So the Prophet ﷺ literally said, right? Wild beasts, animals. Sheikh, we don't take the hadith of Prophet ﷺ metaphorical, right? We don't take it metaphorical. No, so I know some of the scholars said, but that's like a huge ta'wil, because when the Prophet ﷺ says as-siba', siba' is wild beasts, right? He could have said objects. The Prophet ﷺ, you remember the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed to the Prophet ﷺ a lot of things that would happen in the future, right? And so when the Prophet ﷺ says as-siba', wild beasts, it literally means wild beasts. He could have said animals, which would include all animals. So somebody would say, hey, look, we got parrots, right? Or we have whatever the case is. But no, the Prophet ﷺ was very specific. He said as-siba'. As-siba' are those we're talking about wild beasts that are actually we're talking about wolves, lions, tigers, those kind of animals. Does that make sense? I understand it, Sheikh, I understand. But so here's the thing. The default is, because if we're going to, we have to be careful with the metaphorical stuff, right? We have to have evidence for metaphorical. Otherwise, you keep it as it is, because that's a dangerous road that will enter the Quran and everything else. And so this is take literally, and the majority of scholars took it literally, right? Even the people that said phones and not phones, then how are you going to explain the rest of the hadith where the whip will talk to you, right? Your laces will talk to you, your actual thigh will talk to you. Like the thigh itself will talk to you, right? So if the thigh will talk to you, there's no reason why not to believe that literally the beast will talk to you. Yes, Asha. Yes. Mm-hmm. Not responding. Your thigh will speak. The word speak, which means it would verbalize, speak. Like we can't take the hadith out of context, Sheikh. We can't, right? Because it's, once again, it's not something that is impossible to happen, especially that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that He would make your hand speak on the Day of Judgment. So one can say, khalas, it's metaphorical on the Day of Judgment, right? No. So when the hadith literally says, وَتَكَلَّمُ فَخِذَهُ, his thigh will speak. Like it will speak, like I'm speaking to you. It will speak, right? The beasts will speak. There's a communication that happens, right? Like a verbal, you'll hear it. And a phone is not a beast. Unless you think it's a jinn there, Sheikh. Astaghfirullah. Sheikh came, he's like, Sheikh, you're using jinn. I'm like, what? Everything electronic is jinn. Alhamdulillah. طيب. What time is it? طيب. The other sign that hasn't happened yet, and some people mistaken that it's from the major signs, but it's not, it's considered from the minor signs, is the emergence of the Mahdi, right? Khuruj al-Mahdi, the real Mahdi, not the Shi'i Mahdi, right? There's two different ones. The Mahdi that we're talking about from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and there's many of them. One of them is, for example, is narrated an Ali Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, and this is reported by Ibn Majah and Imam Ahmed rahimahullah. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Mahdi minna ahl al-bayt yuslihu Allahu fi layla. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Mahdi is from us, the people of the house, ahl al-bayt, which means talking about the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ. يُصْلِحُ اللَّهُ فِي لَيْلَةٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would correct his affairs in one night. Now, this hadith, there's many different hadiths, right? But the gist of all these hadith, or the summary of it, is that there will appear at the end, close to the end of time, that there will be a person that would rule the Arabs and fill the earth with justice, and that's al-Mahdi. after it's been filled with tyranny and oppression, and that he is from the household of the Prophet ﷺ, and his name is that matches the name of the Prophet ﷺ. His name will be Muhammad ibn Abdullah, right? And when the Prophet ﷺ said, يُصْلِحُ الْيَوْمُ فِي لَيْلَةٍ يُصْلِحُ اللَّهُ فِي لَيْلَةٍ, which means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would correct his affairs overnight, meaning that al-Mahdi himself does not know he's a Mahdi. Like the Mahdi himself did not know he's a Mahdi. Like this happens overnight. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala corrects his affairs, and the people will give him a bay'ah. Right? The people will gather around him and will give him a covenant of a bay'ah. And so he himself does not recognize that he is a Mahdi. And so anybody that comes to you and claims that I'm a Mahdi, right, then you just say it's not the end of time yet, right? Don't worry about it. Because we do see a lot of that. Like I've seen myself, people send emails to or text or whatever the case to a sheikh, say, Sheikh, I've read the description of the Mahdi, I look exactly like him. I think I'm the Mahdi, right? Well, I don't think so, right? First of all, what's your name? It's not Muhammad ibn Abdullah, right? And even if it does, are you from the lineage of Prophet ﷺ? And even if it is, where's the bay'ah that's going to happen? Like this person didn't know he's the Mahdi, right? And we have to be careful with some of these things because, unfortunately, those people that come out and claim to be a Mahdi, they end up having followers, by the way, unfortunately, right? Now, of course, this is different than the Shi'i Mahdi that had existed. That's their 12th Imam, and he went into hiding in the basement, and he's been alive for the past, I don't know how many thousand years, or 900, 800 years, and they're waiting for him to come out. That's completely different, right? We don't believe that, but we believe he hasn't appeared yet. He's an individual that will come from the lineage of the Prophet until the end, towards closer to the end of time. طيب. So I'm gonna end the minor signs over here. Then we transition to the major signs, right? I thought I would finish earlier. There's 10 minutes left. I think we should leave it probably to next week. You guys okay with that? Yes, inshallah? طيب. We have chai, ya Sheikh? We do? طيب. We have 10 minutes before Iqamah, inshallah. No, it's a minor sign. It's considered a minor sign. And that's why some people consider it a major sign. And some things that people place as a minor sign, many of the scholars put it as a major sign. So for example, when the Prophet ﷺ said, when he talked about al-Jahjah, right, the one that's gonna, from al-Habasha, the Suwayqa, right, who's going to destroy the Kaaba. So the destruction of the Kaaba will happen. Some might think it's a minor sign, but that's more, considered, people put it to the major sign, because this will happen after the, Isa ibn Maryam will happen after all these signs. And so this is more towards the end, where the Kaaba will be destroyed, and there will be, very few people that remaining that are Muslims, until people, only people that remain will be saying Allah, Allah, and that's it, right? And so these people even would be considered kind of they have a bit of tawheed, but even they, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send a breeze that would take their souls and lives, and day of judgment would happen only on the worst of people that exist. And so there's a progression that happened, like a decrease, right? And so after the Mahdi, this is when we're the battle is going to happen against Bani Israel and all these things, and then Isa ibn Maryam will descend, and then the Dajjal was there. So all these now minor sense things will happen quickly. But after that era of flourishing will happen, there'll be a decrease. Towards the end of it is the destruction of the Kaaba, right? Now, some people might confuse that by what happened, that the black stone was stolen. Kaaba was not destroyed. It was only a part of it, right? And that was retrieved later on. And although not the full stone was retrieved, only parts of the black stone. And so when we go to the Kaaba, by the way, whatever is remaining there is only parts of the black stone that is remaining. It's not the full black stone. That's not the destruction of the Kaaba, right? We're talking about the literal demolishing of the Kaaba by how the Prophet described him was an insignificant person from Al-Habasha, Ethiopia. Wallahu a'lam. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.